support. A strong public health system can quickly alert us to new problems. It can build resilient communities that are healthy and socially connected. It creates a reserve capacity to respond to an emergency of any kind, which is why I co-authored that op-ed with Senator Daschle and FDA Commissioner Andy von Eschenbach in support of what was a $4.5 billion public health infrastructure fund. It's really interesting. We've not consistently provided the type of funding that's needed to build a ongoing, strong public health system. In fact, if you look back at the Great Recession, frontline state and local health departments have lost more than 56,000 positions due to funding cuts. These are the people we need, whether for contact tracing or for epidemiology. They have been lost now over the last about 10 years. So strong, predictable investments from the federal government will ensure that public health departments here on the ground in your community are fully staffed and resourced and able to handle the needs of today's demand for things like the contact tracing force.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Senator Burr is next, and for 17 years, he has been busy writing many of the laws we're talking about today. Senator Burr.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for that recognition. Senator Friss, Secretary Leavitt, Dr. Gerberding, Dr. Kuldon, welcome. We value the ability to pick your brain on this. I think this is probably the most important period in this pandemic is when we begin to do the after-action review and figure out what worked, what didn't work, what needs to be changed. And it's important for Congress to go through this process. When we moved the last PAPA reauthorization bill out of this committee, I reminded my colleagues at that time, this was by no means the finish line, and much work remained for us to be better prepared. Dr. Gerberding, you were in a unique situation at CDC and now in the private sector, but in your testimony, you advocate for a greater use of public-private partnerships. During our last HELP committee hearing on the pandemic, I urged the CDC to put these types of collaborations in place so that we could leverage innovative technology companies in our ability to detect, to identify, and to track threats, including emergency infectious disease. Given your experience at the helm at CDC, why was the agency so ill-equipped to put these types of agreements in place before the pandemic? And what would you recommend to CDC going forward as it relates to public-private partnerships?
Thank you, Senator. And I must say, I don't know what the CDC was or was not doing in collaboration with private sector partners. I'm just seeing it from the outside looking in. There has been a tradition of recognizing the importance of the private sector. When I was there, we had desks in the Emergency Operations Center for a number of private sector entities that we recognize as important in supply and stockpile and logistics and testing, et cetera. But I also say that there are some complexities of working with the private sector and government. And I just go back to what Governor Leavitt said in the context of planning for influenza pandemic, where we recognize that the federal government has a critical role. But what we've learned then and what I think we're seeing now is that the private sector is powerful, and leveraging that power and those resources is essential to being able to scale a national response.
Well, I thank you for that. I think that the deficiency was most evident in testing and the inability for CDC to reach out to the private sector. Thank goodness PAPA reauthorization allowed an expansion of authorities by the director at FDA to use emergency use authorizations to set up these public-private partnerships, and we have probably more capacity than is being utilized in testing nationwide today. One of the areas where efficiencies can be gained in vaccine manufacture and production is through the use of platform technology, Dr. Gerberding. For example, Merck licensed Ebola vaccine platforms being used to develop coronavirus vaccine. How can we enhance the coordination between innovators, BARDA, FDA to ensure that these platforms against these threats is as efficient as possible when the need arises? In other words, how do we keep these platforms as an approved entity and we only do the clinical proof on what we're trying to treat off the platforms?
I think BARDA is well on its way to being able to accomplish that. I think CEPI is another model, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. But what needs to happen is not necessarily having a focus on efficiency. We need to have a broader expectation that we'll invest in a lot of things that won't pan out. If we aim for efficiency, we're going to be slow and miss the boat. We need to be prepared to experiment, to try a broader array of things. And I continue to think that BARDA is critical to the coordination of all of that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gerberding. This question is to my good friend Mike Levitt and Bill Frist. We did what I thought was revolutionary at the time with the investment in 3 flex manufacturing facilities for vaccines. And the testimony's been correct that they were designed for the annual influenza or some variation. At the time, H1N1, H5N1, and they're very difficult to program over and surge in front of that a vaccine for coronavirus. Can both of you give us what you think this committee should do legislatively to encourage the creation of some type of multi-manufacturing facilities that can be utilized when the federal government feels a national need?
So I will respond quickly. First, just annual appropriation supporting it when there's not a crisis is the first thing that has to happen, because it's keeping facilities warm and keeping access to them during those periods that makes it possible when there is a need.
Senator Frist?
Yes, and Senator Burr, again, thank you. Just, 17, 18 years ago, I remember all the nights in the Majority Leader office as you helped put together BARDA, so thanks for that. I think it is going to come down a little bit to what Senator Murray asked about increased funding and how we do it. I'm on record as supporting a mandatory appropriation, about $4.5 billion fund. But also I mentioned in my testimony the HDO, which is an annual appropriation, which really comes to what Governor Levitt talked about. An annual appropriation in a sort of a defense category would allow you to fund to BARDA individually, to NIH individually, discretionary funding, and to the NIH, all 3. But it would be annual, and it would be annual appropriations with oversight by the United States Senate, by the Congress itself. That does have the advantage of this timeliness of incorporating science, what is needed at a particular time, and guarantees that funding in a sustained way. So I would also encourage looking at that, because that immediacy of what is needed 2 years from now is going to be very different, as we just saw with flu vaccine manufacturing versus the current manufacturing. So it's going to have to be flexible, and it's going to have to be nimble. And you might consider, even though it's not directly in your committee, that sort of annual appropriation oversight, be able to support the type of public-private partnerships in this area of manufacturing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Burr. Senator Casey is next, and he too has been very involved, being the principal Democratic co-sponsor of the last reauthorization of the PAPA bill, I believe. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for noting that. And I'm grateful for the testimony of our witnesses and the wisdom and experience they bring to bear on these issues for this hearing. I wanted to start with Dr. Khaldun regarding what you have seen in a lot of what's in your testimony with regard to the challenge you face in the state of Michigan, like so many other states. I know that Detroit, obviously one of the hardest hit cities in the country, just like our major cities, like Philadelphia, have been hit, especially in the Black community. And that's true in so many of our urban areas. I know that in your testimony, I guess when you compare the percent of the population of African Americans in Michigan, about 14%, but 40% of the deaths and more than 30% of the cases. In our state, the death number percent might be a little lower, but it far outstrips the percent of the population. We've had to date at least 1,368 deaths of Black Pennsylvanians from COVID-19. So I have 2 questions. The first one is, how have the social determinants of health impacted people's ability to protect themselves and their families from the virus and from the COVID-19 disease?
So thank you, Senator Casey. So absolutely, when you talk about the health disparities that we're seeing, not just in Michigan, but across the country, those social determinants of health, so housing, transportation, access to healthcare, poverty, those are the things that we believe are really contributing to the disparities in COVID-19 as they contribute to other health disparities. So again, people who are of color are more likely to live in poverty. They've been more deemed as essential workers coming out of their house instead of being able to safely work from home, needing to take public transportation, living in crowded or perhaps unsafe living conditions, making them more likely to spread COVID-19. So those are some of the things that we've seen in Michigan that we believe are contributing to the disparities.
And I guess as well, many, I should say, African Americans are the ones who are on the front lines and often the very front of the front lines. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Senator Casey. So again, going back to the fact that people of color are more likely to live in poverty and therefore more likely to have those lower wage jobs. Some of our grocery store workers, bus drivers, those types of jobs. And those are the exact people that when across the country we had stay home or stay safe orders, a lot of those people were unable to stay at home. They had to come out, and I believe that contributed to the disparities and the disparate numbers of deaths that we've seen.
Thank you, Doctor. The second question I have is, we know that public health is driven at very much a state and local level, but obviously this pandemic has reminded us that all levels of government need the help of the federal government. And I guess when you step back and look at where we've been, what parts of the response so far do you believe require coordination and the convening power of the federal government?
Yes, so I think that very early on, and first let me actually start by saying I really appreciate the support of my federal colleagues at the CDC who since January have been really supportive of us at the state and local level in Michigan. But I do think that we should have had, as I said in my testimony, a more urgent testing response in our communities. Early on my state lab, we were preparing in January actually to be able to perform the test, but we ran into delays. And I'm sure that in Michigan, because of those delays, there were people who weren't tested and the disease was spreading before we even knew it. So I believe that a coordinated strategy at the federal level would have helped us in that way. Also with PPE, we had to fight other states and even local governments in being able to get access to PPE, and it really delayed us and I think exposed many more people to the virus in Michigan.
And finally, Dr. Gerberding, I want to thank you for your help in Pennsylvania, helping our citizens in our state to better understand what we've been up against, and particularly grateful for that. I guess in the 30 seconds we have, you've spoken about an immunization infrastructure. Could you fill in for us? I know your testimony spoke to this, the kind of the who, what, when, where, the mechanics of that, who should be involved, and what role the federal government should play.
Children and are just beginning to improve that for adolescents and adults, but it's fragile. And I think one of the most important things that's not getting enough attention right now is the fact that distributing this vaccine, even in the United States, is going to be incredibly challenging. Making the decision about who goes first, how to allocate doses as they become available, and how to sustain that atmosphere of trust and willingness to step forward and receive it. So the infrastructure for that is going to be local. And that means that we need to support our local and state health officials in getting ready to make those really hard decisions and implement that really macro program.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Frist, it's great to see you again. We've missed you. One of the lessons from the COVID pandemic is that our country is far too dependent on foreign manufacturing of drugs, diagnostics, and medical supplies. For example, about 80% of the basic components used in medicines, the active pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from China and India for our U.S. market. The exact dependence remains unknown since there's no API registry. Well, what happened is just about the time that the COVID-19 epidemic hit the United States, India stopped exporting 26 APIs and finished drugs. The CARES Act includes portions of legislation that I introduced with Senator Tina Smith, the MEDS Act, that includes greater reporting requirements on the sources of APIs, as well as redundancy plans intended to deal with shortages. But are there specific incentives that the Senate should consider specifically to encourage domestic manufacturing, including perhaps tax incentives or greater investment in FDA's emerging technology program?
Thank you, Senator Collins. And I think this whole coordination of procurement is huge. And in the committee's white paper, we talked about coordination procurement as being a very clear and important federal responsibility. As you pointed out, we've been inadequately prepared here. We've seen it day in and day out. And we can do so much more to establish this resilient domestic, right here at home manufacturing lines, the tracking of supply chains, ensuring a robust support of the national strategic stockpile. The incentives will have to be financial. The real problem in these public-private, or the real challenge in these public-private partnerships, is this lack of continued funding over time to adjust the market, where on the private sector, they'll be generous and they'll be patriotic, but at the end of the day, they do need to report fiscal responsibility. So we have to step in, whether it's with the direct tax credits, whether it's with a funding stream by an artificial market that is set up over time. We do have to keep a revenue stream out there that is dependable, that is sustainable, and that is long-term, and that is flexible, because it will change year to year in terms of what those manufacturing, the specific manufacturing needs are. As for the testing itself, the tests are remarkable right now between the public-private partnerships and the private sector moving ahead, and it's being revolutionized before our eyes in a very quick fashion. Now, it came too late. But now, so in encouraging more and more of that with some sort of financial incentive.
Thank you. Dr. Gerberding, last month the Aging Committee held a hearing on the impact of the coronavirus on older adults living in nursing homes. And that hearing reaffirmed my belief that a baseline test for all residents and staff, not just those that are symptomatic, is necessary to prevent outbreaks. COVID-19's impact on long-term care settings directly intersects with the stark racial disparities that we're seeing. And unfortunately and remarkably, Maine has the nation's worst COVID-19 racial disparity. Many of the worst outbreaks that have occurred in Maine are in nursing homes, and the CDC reports that some 40% of those healthcare workers that have tested positive were identified as Black or African Americans. As a former director of the CDC, what do you recommend as the best way for Congress to help address this racial disparity among those that are the frontline workers in our nursing homes?
Thank you, Senator. Obviously, we need to test symptomatic people in their context, but to me, the third most important reason to test are the people who are working in these known high-risk environments, and clearly nursing homes are among those at the top of that list. Those are intrinsic hotspots, and we need to test often and test everyone who comes and goes from those centers until such time that we can demonstrate that transmission has been contained. I can't say enough about how critical it is to not overlook the most vulnerable people. And that includes the elderly people, but also those who are vulnerable on the basis of underlying conditions. And often that tracks with the racial and ethnic disparities that you're alluding to. It's a very difficult challenge. The solution to it is multifactorial. It really is a reflection of the social determinants of health as much as anything else. And that's a long answer, and I know I have a short period of time, but the first step is to make the measurement clear and transparent so that we all have to stare it in the face and recognize that we're not successful until we deal with that challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having trouble with my mute button here.
You're on now.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to start by just reflecting that every member of this committee would love to be able to turn the page on the current pandemic and start planning for the next one. But the cases of COVID-19 and hospitalizations continue to rise, and we can't divert our attention from the ongoing crisis. And I think it's very clear that
to make personal protective equipment, develop multiple vaccine candidates, authorize use of more than 100 medical devices and drugs for emergency use, weighing the known and potential benefits and risks at the time, all at unprecedented speeds. These innovations have the ability to serve us well and far beyond this pandemic. We have seen remarkable coordination, flexibility, and cooperation between the executive branch, private sector, faith groups, volunteers, and lawmakers. America is strongest when we work together to achieve common goals. We're constantly learning how to improve our preparedness. We must adjust our response based off of facts at hand and focus on how to best move forward. We must unite in a common fight against this virus. Just as America mobilized in World War II to do whatever it took, today our distinguished panelists have mobilized America's finest scientists, logisticians, and entrepreneurs to beat this deadly, microscopic enemy. Thank you for your leadership, for your years of public service, and for your dedication to this life-saving mission. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, and I thank the ranking member, and I'd like to now introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. I keep calling the White House Task Force on Coronavirus, but I don't actually know whether that's still in existence or whether you're all members of it anymore. So first we have Dr. Robert Redfield, the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We have Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. We have Admiral Brett Giroir, Assistant Secretary for Health, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Stephen Hahn, who's the Commissioner of U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you all for being here today, and I know it's going to be worthwhile. At this time, the chair is going to recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the lighting system. In front of you is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. And of course, you should try to wrap up your testimony at that point, and the light will turn red when your time expires. You probably know this already, but I'll mention it again. So we're going to start with Dr. Redfield, recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you with my HHS colleagues. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic continues in the United States and around the world. This pandemic is the greatest public health crisis our nation and our world have confronted in more than a century. While overall case counts are going down, several communities are seeing increased cases driven by multiple factors, including increased testing, outbreaks, and evidence of community transmission. Right now, the most powerful weapon against this disease are social distancing, face coverings, and hand hygiene. These actions will help us contain transmission, along with readily available testing, comprehensive timely contact tracing, timely isolation of known cases, and self-quarantine to break the chains of transmission. Once again, I call on the American people to remain vigilant in our collective obligation to protect those who may be at risk for severe complications of COVID-19 due to age or underlying medical conditions. We must also lessen the burden of COVID-19 among racial and ethnic groups disproportionately impacted. And ethnicity from our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. Reporting from hospital surveillance sites, for example, have increased in completeness on race and ethnicity from 30% to now more than 80%. CDC is also receiving more complete data from our public health partners. A recent CDC study examined more than 1.3 million COVID-19 cases, found that the most underlying health conditions were cardiovascular, diabetes, obesity, and chronic lung disease. Hospitalizations were 6 times higher for these individuals and death 12 times higher, those reporting these conditions compared to those without. CDC is working to ensure the equity and health outcomes and the social determinants are being addressed through the COVID-19 response. CDC continues to provide communities with technical expertise, tools, and information to confront the virus. Documents would have been consulted more than 1.5 billion times on the CDC website. We've deployed over 5,000 personnel in the response. We have more than 40 rapid response teams on the ground now, providing local health departments and health officials with expertise in epidemiology, surveillance, infection control, laboratory science, and community mitigation. We're enormously grateful to the heroes of the response That's the public health and healthcare professionals, the first responders, the critical infrastructure workers who have served and sacrificed too much. CDC and our nation's public health partners are actively working on the front lines of this pandemic to remedy the shortcomings in a public health system that has been under-resourced for decades. With your support, CDC has been able to award nearly $12 billion to states, territories, tribes, and when confronted by any disease threat, CDC and public health departments must make real-time decisions based on real-time data. Data is the backbone of any disease threat response. With the resources that Congress has provided, data monetization is underway. We also must ensure that our laboratories have resilience, advanced technology, personnel, expertise, and supplies are being sourced. Our public health workforce must grow exponentially to address COVID-19 and future public health threats. Thousands of contact tracers are on board and being recruited by public health departments across our nation. Bottom line, sustained investment in the public health system is an investment in the health and prosperity of our nation. Last, CDC has begun to prepare for months ahead when the next season's influenza increasing the challenges on hospitals, healthcare professionals, and the public. This fall, before the seasonal circulation of influenza increased, I encouraged the American people to be prepared and to embrace flu vaccination with confidence for yourself, your families, and the communities. This single act will save lives. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walden. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you today the role of the National Institutes of Health and Research addressing COVID-19. The approach to the NIH is very similar to what we do with other emerging infections. It's a four-pronged approach. First, to study the fundamental knowledge of the virus itself, as well as the host response to the virus. The second is to help develop diagnostics and assays. The third is to characterize and test therapeutics. And the fourth is to develop safe and effective vaccines. Speaking of the first, fundamental knowledge of the virus and what the virus is capable of doing. We've done a number of studies now that have informed how we're approaching therapeutics and vaccines. For example, the precise molecular structure of the spike protein, which is that part of the virus which actually gives it its name, coronavirus, because of these spikes that stick out from the virus. That is the way the virus binds to cells in the body. This has been precisely delineated by NIH scientists and those that we fund. Second, the demonstration of the precise receptor whereby the virus binds to cells in the body, allowing it to enter and cause disease. In addition, we develop animal models. We do natural history studies, such as understanding the virus in different demographic groups. Second is the development of diagnostics and assays. We need, and we will get within a reasonable period of time, based on a major investment in the RADx program, diagnostics that are point of care, simple, precise, sensitive, and specific. We hope by the end of the fall and into the early winter, we will have these for wide distribution. Third, the development and characterization of drugs. You've all heard of the first successful randomized placebo-controlled trial of a drug called remdesivir, which was used in hospitalized patients with lung disease. It showed a statistically significant but modest impact on decreasing the time to release from the hospital, namely faster recovery. In addition, this drug is now being used in combination with another drug that blocks the inflammatory in plasma, hyperimmune globulin, other drugs, monoclonal antibodies, as well as other immune-based therapies. Fourth, the development of safe and effective vaccines, the hallmark of all really defining responses that we have to virus diseases. If you look at the history of viral diseases, it is generally vaccines that put the nail in the coffin of these types. We are now mounting a major effort in which we're collaborating with industry and public-private partnerships to get vaccine trials that are developed that harmonize with each other. In other words, to have multiple trials in which we have common questions that are being asked, common laboratories that are being looked at, common data and safety monitoring board, and common primary, secondary, and tertiary endpoints, so that the data can be compared from one to another. You've probably heard that one of those vaccines, and there are more than one, there are several that are moving along at various paces. One of them will enter phase 3 study in July. This is one that has already shown in preliminary studies some very favorable response in the animal models that were developed. There will be others that will follow 1 month, 2 months, 3 months later. Although you can never guarantee at all the safety and efficacy of a vaccine until you actually test it in the field, we feel cautiously optimistic based on the concerted effort and the fact that we are taking financial risks, not risks to safety, not risks to the integrity of the science, but financial risks to be able to be ahead of the game so that when, and I believe it will be when and not if, we get favorable candidates with good results, we will be able to make them available to the American public, as I said to this committee months ago, within a year from when we started, which would put us at the end of this calendar year and the beginning of 2021. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, and be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, and thanks for all your contributions to fighting this pandemic. And I'll say the same about Admiral Giroir, who I bother the most. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Admiral.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, and I always enjoy our conversation. You call me anytime. Ranking Member Walden, distinguished members of the committee. On March 12th, Secretary Azar requested that I lead the coordination of COVID-19 testing efforts within the Department of Health and Human Services. And I would like to be clear that although I am no longer full-time deployed to FEMA, I am maintaining my role coordinating testing. To date, the nation has performed over 27 million COVID-19 tests, now averaging about 500,000 tests per day. Even without any major technical advances, I estimate the nation will have the capacity to perform between 40 to 50 million tests per month by fall. To address the public health challenges over the past months, we implemented a phased approach to meet the testing needs at each stage of the pandemic, especially now during reopening when the need for testing is the greatest. In early March, HHS and FEMA developed and implemented 41 community-based drive-through testing sites in locations prioritized by the CDC in collaboration with our state and local partners. These sites have tested nearly 300,000 high-risk individuals and served as prototypes that have been duplicated multifold. Next, we leveraged trusted pharmacies to further implement community testing, especially for minorities and underserved. This federal program is now providing testing at 611 locations in 47 states and the district, 70% of which are in communities with moderate to high social vulnerability. This program has tested over 688,000 individuals. Federally qualified health centers serve over 29 million people across the nation. They provide care to 1 in 5 of those uninsured, 1 in 5 rural Americans, 1 in 3 living in poverty, and 1.3 million homeless. Again, to assure we reach these most vulnerable among us, 93% of FQHCs offer COVID-19 testing. To further expand access, we authorized all licensed pharmacists to order and administer COVID-19 testing under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness, or PrEP Act. Over 90% of Americans live within 5 miles of a pharmacy, again assuring widespread availability. On June 4th, using authorities provided to the Secretary under CARES, HHS released new mandatory laboratory reporting. Lab reports must include demographic information like race, ethnicity, age, and gender. And today, I am pleased to announce the selection of Morehouse School of Medicine as the awardee for a new $40 million initiative to fight COVID-19 among racial and ethnic minorities, as well as rural and other socially vulnerable communities. This cooperative agreement with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health's Office of Minority Health and Morehouse School of Medicine will develop and implement a strategic network of national, state, territorial, tribal, and local organizations to deliver COVID-19 related information to communities hardest hit by the pandemic. In the first year of this agreement, Morehouse School of Medicine will receive $15 million. This massive expansion of testing resulted in unprecedented demand for supplies, reagents, and laboratory platforms. To meet this demand, we secured the global supply chain through a military air bridge. We worked directly with manufacturers to increase domestic production. We collaborated with external partners to validate new technologies. We secured and prioritized scarce point-of-care tests for state public health laboratories, the Indian Health Service, and other critical needs. Finally, we used Title III of the Defense Production Act to further invest in domestic manufacturing. These actions and others have enabled our current efforts with states, territories, and tribes to implement evidence-based diagnostic and surveillance plans. I would like to close by recognizing my fellow officers in the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, the uniformed service that I lead. 4,482 officers have deployed to support the pandemic response, including to the Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan, to our military bases repatriating Americans, to our community-based testing sites, to FEMA and task forces directly inside nursing homes, and to field hospitals across our nation, exemplifying the care and compassion that all of us feel for those who have suffered during this pandemic. I thank each and every one of these officers and their families, and on their behalf, I would like to thank all of you in Congress for supporting our training needs and the establishment of a ready reserve corps to supplement our ranks during inevitable future national emergencies. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide these remarks.
Thank you, Admiral, and thank you for mentioning the both military and civilians who are out front in helping us during this crisis. We really appreciate all that they do, and we have to make sure that we help them as much as possible. So last but certainly not least, because the FDA is just as important, is Dr. Hahn, or Commissioner Hahn.
Sir. Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. First, I'd like to start by thanking all of you for your support of the agency and U.S. government with the laws that you've passed and become law of the land. It has helped a great deal in our response. FDA has a critical role in the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We remain focused on our mission of protecting and promoting the health and safety of Americans. President Trump has requested, and we have provided appropriate regulatory flexibilities to assure that the American public have access to critical medical products, safe foods, and a confidence that the government is taking measures to address important public health issues. FDA has used our emergency authorities since the beginning of this pandemic. We have issued more than 100 emergency use authorizations for diagnostics, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and other devices, as well as for drug products. Since the public health emergency was declared, we issued more than 50 guidance documents to help ensure the continuity of health care and safe food supply, and we put into place new initiatives to accelerate the development of needed products. Additionally, we have kept the American public up to date on what they need to do to protect themselves and to contain the virus from spreading. We are now preparing for the next phase of addressing this evolving crisis. It is mission critical that the agency continue to be diligent, assuring the safety of the products that we regulate, and that we also put in place processes needed to assure the protections that the public will need. There are a number of experiences we have gained over the past few months that will inform our plans. We recognize that we must be bold in our decision-making and advance effective solutions to achieve challenging public health objectives. Therefore, we have begun a comprehensive real-time review and assessment of our actions to date to address the COVID-19 pandemic. The objective is to identify and address potential organizational and programmatic changes that should be implemented without delay to advance the ongoing response to COVID-19. We need to assure that we leverage what is working well, while at the same time review our framework and policies to be positioned to effectively identify and respond to quickly evolving public health situations. A major focus of this effort will be to identify what regulatory policies should be continued and accelerated consistent with Executive Order 13294 signed by the President. Durable policy, organizational and programmatic changes will be consistent with advancing the agency's public health mission and will inform our strategic priorities moving forward. One of the challenges facing FDA during the COVID-19 pandemic is how to assure the timely review of medical product applications despite an incredible surge in volume and constraints on our ability to conduct in-site inspections. I am pleased to announce today that FDA has maintained the same pace of meeting its goals on applications for medical products for the last 6 months that it has maintained in recent years. We are on target to meet our user fee goals for the drugs this year by reviewing and taking timely action on at least 90% of brand, generic, and biosimilar drug applications, even during the pandemic. Additionally, this work has continued at a time when the number of applications received in some centers is substantially higher than the pre-COVID-19 times. I want to thank the more than 17,000 employees of the FDA for their incredible efforts, one that reflects the remarkable dedication and commitment to the public health of all Americans. Finally, I'd like to discuss what is top of mind for all Americans, namely the work that FDA is doing to facilitate the development of safe vaccines and therapeutics. FDA launched an emergency review and development program called the Coronavirus Treatment Accelerator Program, or CTAP, and we continue to work night and day to provide guidance and to review proposals from companies, scientists, and researchers who are developing therapies. Let me be clear that data and science will dictate when we will have safe and effective treatments and vaccines for COVID-19, as Dr. Fauci just mentioned. Toward that end, FDA is using every available authority and applying every appropriate regulatory flexibility to facilitate development and testing. We have not lost sight of our solemn responsibility to the American people to ensure our decisions related to all medical products are based on science and data, and that is a commitment that the American public can have confidence in. Again, I assure you that the FDA will provide leadership, expertise, guidance, information, and whatever else is needed as we continue to address this unprecedented challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Hahn. That concludes our openings from the witnesses. And so now we'll move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Now, you know that I'm very critical of the president for a lack of leadership from the start of this pandemic, which I think continues. And of course, it's difficult because you work in theory for the president. And I feel that many of you on many occasions actually wanted to take more leadership and be, as Dr. Hahn mentioned, or Commissioner Hahn, fully cognizant of the data and the science. So it's difficult because I'm going to ask you questions about the president's lack of leadership, and I know it's hard for you to answer those, so we'll see. But I do believe the president is encouraging behaviors that are not consistent with good public health, such as encouraging thousands to attend a rally and not mandate the wearing of masks. And I can't imagine that NIH or CDC would suggest this as a best practice in the face of this pandemic. So it's sort of like there's two versions of reality here. One's the president's and one's hopefully yours based on data and science. But I want to hear from the experts. So let me start with Dr. Fauci. You are a trusted voice and have always been candid with us and the American public. Give us an unvarnished view of where we are at our fight against COVID-19, quickly if you can.
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman. It really is a mixed bag. We have a very large country, very heterogeneous, major differences, for example, between the New York metropolitan area and Casper, Wyoming. If you look at how we've been hit badly. I mean, anybody who looks at the numbers, we've had now over 120,000 deaths, and we've had 2.5 million infections. So it's a serious situation. In some respects, we've done very well. Right now, for example, the New York metropolitan area, which has been hit extraordinarily hard, has done very well in bringing the cases down and using the guidelines that we have very carefully put together in a stepwise fashion to try and carefully reopen their city and their state. However, in other areas of the country, we're now seeing a disturbing surge of infections that looks like it's a combination, but But one of the things is an increase in community spread. And that's something that I'm really quite concerned about that. And you know that this has been something that's been in the press over the past couple of days, where we were going down from 30,000 to 25 to 20, and now we sort of stayed about flat, and now we're going up. A couple of days ago, there were 30,000 new infections. That's very troublesome to me. The way you address that, and I've said this over and over again, is you have to have the manpower, the system, the testing to identify, isolate, and contact trace in an effective way so that when you see those increases, you can understand where they're coming from and you can do something about them. Right now, the next couple of weeks are going to be critical in our ability to address those surgings that we're seeing in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, and in other states. They're not the only ones that are having a difficulty. Bottom line, Mr. Chairman, it's a mixed bag. Some good and some now we have a problem with.
All right, now I'm going to have to ask about the president because you talked about testing and how important it is, and Admiral Giroir and I know how important it is. At his rally over the weekend, the president said, and I quote, "When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please," unquote. And this morning he said he meant this. So Dr. Fauci, do you agree with that? Does it make sense that to safely open our economy, we should be limiting the number of tests rather than ensuring that anyone who needs a test can get one? And you don't have to mention the president, I did, but tell us about the testing. And your microphone is on.
Sorry. I, as a member of the task force, and my colleagues on the task force, to my knowledge, I know for sure, but to my knowledge, none of us have ever been told to slow down on testing. That just is a fact. In fact, we will be doing more testing, as you've heard from Admiral Giroir, not only testing to specifically identify people in the identify, isolate, and contact trace, but also much more surveillance if you want to get your arms around and understand exactly what's going on in community spread. So it's the opposite. We're going to be doing more testing, not less.
And then let me just ask the same question of Dr. Redfield. Do you agree with the president on this, or do you think we should be testing more people? You don't want to talk about the president, just tell us if you think we should be testing more people.
Yes, Dr. Fauci said, all of us have been and continue to be committed to increasing readily, timely access to testing. We've made a marked improvement. We still have a ways to go. One of the key things, as Tony mentioned, is surveillance, expanding surveillance because of the asymptomatic nature of this infection. And in doing so, we're looking at ways that can really substantially enhance testing by potentially pooling samples. So right now, as Gerard said, we're doing 500,000, 600,000 tests a day. If we can pool samples 5 to 1, that would bring it to 3 million tests a day. So we're continuing to try to enhance testing. It's a critical underpinning of our response.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I recognize Mr. Walden now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me go straight to the question that my colleague asked, and I'll just ask each of you for a yes or no answer. Has President Trump ever directed you to slow down testing for COVID-19 in the United States? Dr. Redfield?
No.
No, sir.
No, Congressman.
Thank you. All right, let's go to some other issues here. Dr. Hahn, you created a website, I believe, on the FDA site dealing with convalescent plasma and antibody-rich investigational therapies that may help fight the virus. What's the status of the research into the effectiveness of convalescent plasma in fighting COVID-19? What do we know right now?
Thank you, Congressman Walden. Really important question from a therapeutics point of view. As everyone here knows, convalescent plasma is where you take the natural immunity from a person who's recovered from COVID-19, those antibodies, and then administer it to a person who's sick. So we have partnered with BARDA and HHS, as well as the Mayo Clinic, to develop what's called an expanded access program. We have safety data from over 20,000 patients that shows this is a very safe therapy, and our preliminary assessment of the effectiveness of this plasma is quite encouraging. We continue to look at the information. If those data hold, we will have potentially another weapon in the armamentarium against COVID-19, pending those final results. This will also allow us to have information that will feed the development of monoclonal antibodies and something else called hyperimmune globulin, which we can pool that plasma and actually give it as an injection to people. So I think it's a good news story right now. We have to wait for the final data to come in, and we should know very shortly about that. There are also several randomized trials looking at this as well that are ongoing across the country.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Redfield, CDC has developed a new test to simultaneously detect 2 strains of influenza and the COVID-19 and is seeking an emergency use authority. How does the CDC envision its combined tests to be used?
Yeah, I think it's very important, as I mentioned, as we get to the fall, we're going to have influenza and COVID at the same time. And CDC is developing that test for the public health system, but in parallel, the private sector now has also got advanced development. Maybe Dr. Hahn wants to comment on similar tests in the private sector, so to facilitate timely diagnosis of these 2 co-circulating pathogens.
Dr. Hahn, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, sir. In cooperation with Admiral Giroir, we have been working with companies to actually look at that. Admiral Giroir has been at the forefront of this, and it's been a great partnership.
I would just agree with my colleagues. We're all concerned about the possibility of co-circulation of influenza A and B as well as COVID-19 when it comes to flu season. So we want to do everything we can to simplify the diagnosis, and you can have if you have a single test, and we're working with multiple manufacturers. As is usual, the CDC is usually in the lead, but there are multiple manufacturers, both at point of care and laboratory, who will have this type of test available.
All right, excellent. You all have been subject to a lot of criticism, as has the president. Often that's leveled after we know facts we didn't know at the time when things started. And so it's really great if you have hindsight and 20/20 vision. You can look back and say, should have done that then. I want to look forward. What is it you need from Congress that you do not have now to have America ready for the fall? What should we be preparing for now for the fall? I don't care who wants to start, but I'm down to a minute to answer. So, Dr. Redfield?
I think first I want to just express our appreciation to Congress for the supplemental funding. I think it's of note that CDC has been able already to disperse $12 billion to the states to help prepare their COVID responses, and really that's an unprecedented amount of resources. I would only ask that we look to how to make this a sustainable investment as opposed to a sporadic investment to this particular challenge we have right now.
All right. Dr. Fauci, what do we need to worry about? What don't you have?
Well, just to reiterate what Dr. Redfield said, we are extraordinarily grateful for the unprecedented amount of supplementary funding that the Congress gave to us, which really make it totally possible for us to do the kinds of things we need to do on an emergency basis.
Right.
But again, to mention what Dr. Redfield said, we have to establish some corporate memory. I've said to this committee literally many times over the many years that we forget things when we get distant from them.
Yeah.
We're going through a terrible ordeal right now. We need to have in place the stable type of support for preparedness for outbreaks. We will get through this. This will end, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we need to establish a system so that we are prepared for future outbreaks.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, could the other two just answer that question quickly? Admiral, what do you need you don't have? What should we be worrying about?
I want to express my thanks again to the committee, but let me get to the points. I think sustainability and commitment is very important. I was involved in Ebola in 2015 in Dallas, trying to lead some of the policy options during that time. And you see over a 5-year period, we sort of forgot all the lessons that we were trying to get implemented, including PPE and other stockpiles. I would say some of the biggest limitations, and I know everyone is working on this, is the national data infrastructure we need. When we started out, I'm calling up 100 hospitals a day trying to understand who's on an ICU bed, who's not, who has a ventilator, how much you have left. Okay. And we got through this early, not by systems, but by people working 24/7. The third thing is, I'm just going to pound it, the vaccine infrastructure in this country to promote vaccination, to promote vaccine confidence, to make sure that people have the right information about safety and efficacy, that we order enough flu vaccine, because we really need to get everybody vaccinated this winter. One thing that minimizes our problems, if we get everybody flu vaccine, That's one less virus that could kill 20, 30, 50,000, 70,000, and potentially even be a co-infection with COVID.
Dr. Hahn?
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you for the support. One big point I want to make here is that what we've learned during this epidemic is what Admiral Giroir said, is that we have an access to information issue. We have learned that we need to collect real-world evidence in real time during an emergency, just like a doctor would do during an emergency, to inform decisions and how we could change them moving forward. So your support for real-world evidence generation would be incredibly helpful.
So now we're going to move to our members based on seniority, and I think our next few are virtual. So just remind you to unmute. If you don't do so on your own, I'll just keep reminding you. So next we have Mr. Rush from Illinois.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Last week, the Health Subcommittee held an informative hearing on the racial and ethnic health disparities being highlighted by the coronavirus. The statistics around these disparities are very troubling and even extremely outrageous. A Scientific American article published earlier this month found that and I quote, if Black people were dying at the same rate as white Americans, at least 13,000 mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, and other loved ones would still be alive. Even more shocking is that among those 35 to 44 Black men and women died from the coronavirus at least 9 times the rate of white Americans. Dr. Fauci, when it become apparent that institutional racism and structural discrimination are playing a part in why certain racial and ethnic communities are suffering more than white communities?
I think I know what I didn't hear it quite as clear as I want, but I think I know what the congressman is referring to. So when you're looking at the African American community and the minority community in general as a demographic group, there are two elements that make it much more difficult for them and why they're suffering disproportionately. One is the risk of infection. Because of economic and other considerations, the jobs that the majority of them would find themselves in does not allow them to protect themselves by looking into a computer and doing telework. Most of them are essential on outside, having to mingle in a society in which the virus is circulating. So right at the get-go, they have a greater risk of getting infected. And then we know from a lot of experience now that the situation regarding whether or not you have serious consequences, hospitalizations, intubation, complications, and death relate very strongly to the prevalence and incidence of underlying comorbid conditions, which are clearly disproportionately more expressed in the African American population than in the rest of the population. And that particularly includes hypertension, diabetes, obesity, chronic lung disease, and kidney disease. So unfortunately, we have a situation where it's sort of a double whammy of a negative capability of them to respond through no fault of their own because of underlying conditions and the conditions in which they find themselves with.
Dr. Fauci, would you consider racism itself as being one of the stresses that certainly impacts the African American community more in an extraordinary way that contributes to these comorbidities?
I think the question was, would I consider institutional racism as contributing? No, I don't think there's...
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Well, I mean, obviously, the African American community has suffered from racism for a very, very long period of time. And I cannot imagine that that has not contributed to the conditions that they find themselves in economically and otherwise. So the answer, Congressman, is yes.
Admiral Giroir, I applaud your announcement that provides for $100 million, for $40 million to go to the Morehouse College of Medicine for contact tracing and testing. I have introduced a bill, the TRACE Act, which calls for $100 million for testing and contact tracing. Should we be seeking a larger amount, $100 million or more for contact tracing and for testing?
Thank you, Congressman. For testing and contact tracing, we're going to need billions of dollars. I mean, that's the amounts of investment that we're doing partially through CDC. This specific award is to have Morehouse lead a consortium of organizations like 100 Black Men, UDUNOS US, the National Association of Community Health Workers, the National Council of Urban Indian Health, et cetera, to really focus on the specific educational, testing, and linkage to care needs of underserved minorities, and some of those also in the rural population. My personal opinion is $40 million is a start. It's going to need to be a lot more than that in order to reach the people that we need to reach.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Admiral. Next is Mr. Upton from Michigan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate the testimony that we've heard thus far, and the interaction that we'll have between all of our I guess the first question I have, Dr. Fauci, good friend, thank you for your service for sure. In recent weeks, of course, you made the statement that you thought we would have as many as 100 million doses of an FDA-approved vaccine before the year. I've heard from a number of companies, again, just in recent days, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, hopes to have perhaps 1 billion doses before the end of next year, calendar year 21. So is that our routine now move through the phase 2 process, or maybe even get into some production a little bit later by somewhat early August? Not the approvals yet, but where things, because of the promise of getting it to the marketplace and really saving the world, let's face it. What is your thought as to how early we may see an EUA, an emergency use authorization, approved for any of these vaccines based on what you know today, and under scenarios that we may see something in the next number of months in terms of an approval? Lay out what you think is a real distinct possibility of where we might end up being.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I didn't hear
on as well.
I didn't hear everything you said, but I think I got enough of it to answer your question, at least the last part, that I think is very important, and I welcome the opportunity to address this. The idea about the doses that would be available, you know, a couple of 100 million doses in the beginning of the year, some companies saying that in a couple of years, a year or two, they'll have as many as 1 billion doses. I think that's real. Most people would raise their eyebrows and think that how is that going to happen? And it is because things are being done at risk. Companies are starting to plan to make doses even before you know the vaccine works. So the risk of the speed is not risk to safety, it's not risk to scientific integrity, it's risk to money. So put that aside. The point that Congressman Upton made, I think is very important. We need to be careful that we don't jump because of our need to get vaccines for those who need it, that we do not definitively prove safety and efficacy before we make decisions about distribution. We've heard a lot about emergency use authorization. An emergency use authorization is important, but it has to be done in a situation where you fulfill the criteria for the emergency use authorization. I would be very disappointed if we jumped to a conclusion before we knew that a vaccine was truly safe and truly effective, because I wouldn't want the perpetual ambiguity of not knowing whether or not it is truly safe and truly effective. That's the reason why we're doing several randomized placebo-controlled trials with power enough that could give us that answer. I hope that answers your question, Fred.
Well, just one quick, what would be the earliest that you think, under the best scenario, that we might be able to see an EUA issued by you all, along with, I guess, would actually be the FDA, right? That would actually issue that.
Yes, the answer is yes. Let me just quickly answer that and hand it over to Steve, because he may want to answer that. We're going into the first phase 3 efficacy trial in July. It takes at least a month to get to the second dose because it's a prime boost. You'll take another couple of months to accrue or enroll enough people that if there is viral activity in the community, and we have our sites not only in the United States, but all over the world, in Brazil and in South Africa. So if we get an efficacy signal, you're going to get an efficacy signal more quickly the more cases there are. Now, if it turns out that there are not a lot of cases, it may take longer. And that's the reason why you can't give an accurate prediction of when you're going to get those data. Steve, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Fauci. So just a couple of issues to your point, Congressman Upton. One is we are working with sponsors across the board, private industry, Operation Warp Speed, et cetera, those who are developing vaccines, and we're providing technical assistance regarding clinical trial design, the number of participants in the clinical trials, as well as the endpoints that we want to see to make an adjudication about safety and effectiveness. And I want to emphasize what Dr. Fauci said, and that is the acceleration is really around taking financial risk around the development process. The acceleration is not cutting corners with respect to the assessment of safety and effectiveness. The American people can rely upon the fact that FDA has many experts in the vaccine area. We've been doing this for years, and we will rely upon the science and data when it's available to us to make that adjudication and decision regarding an EUA. I cannot prejudge when that will happen.
Thank you, Fred. Next, we have the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start with Dr. Redfield. Doctor, we had a conversation on the weekend, and I expressed to you really my dismay, my disappointment about you as CDC director, the most prestigious institution in the world on infectious diseases and prevention. The United States today is number one in the world in infections and in deaths. This is not anything that any of us can be proud of. The American people are in pain, they're grieving, there's a great deal of sorrow in communities, there's confusion because for many reasons. And I urged you as head of CDC to speak directly to the American people. I know the agencies are talking to each other. I consider that a whisper because the American people are not hearing you speak out. They deserve to hear the truth. We have heard Dr. Fauci time and time again putting out trusted information to the American people. The American people are divided on this issue of the virus. Imagine that. So I continue to urge you to speak out. You're a doctor. Put your white jacket on and speak weekly to the American people. They want to know what's coming, what is ahead. My constituents ask me on a consistent basis, what's next? What is our government doing? That's a haunting question. And so while we're doing the nice back and forth this morning, good questions on the part of members, I really remain dismayed and deeply disappointed. We need leadership coming out of the CDC. Real leadership. It was an outrage that there was a gathering in Tulsa. 6 of the president's advance people were infected. And it's my understanding the 2 Secret Service agents were. How can the CDC allow this pandemic, this virus, to be something political? You have to push back. You're a scientist, you're a doctor. Now, to Dr. Hahn, I'm sure you've read the several articles regarding hydroxychloroquine. Every study states it doesn't work in any setting. In fact, it has known side effects, cardiac issues being one. So there's a danger in terms of the side effects. As commissioner, you see all the data. Are you going to inform the American people, doctors across the country, about these facts?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. And indeed, we are. I can refer the committee to several documents that we have put out over the last several weeks regarding hydroxychloroquine. With respect to the issues, we issued a safety alert, particularly around the combination of hydroxychloroquine with other drugs that might affect the heart. And as you know, we've taken recent action regarding the EUA.
Have you specifically spoken directly to the American people so there isn't this confusion about hydroxychloroquine?
Yes, ma'am. There is an FDA Voices piece that's authored by me, as well as a piece that's directly to the American people about the status of hydroxychloroquine.
That's on paper. I want to know if you have spoken out verbally to the American people, to doctors across the country. People don't hear paper, with all due respect.
Yes, ma'am, and I appreciate the question, but every opportunity I've had to be in the media, I've been asked that question, and I have communicated that same information about the current status.
I have another question, Dr. Hahn. There have been several disturbing articles expressing concerns relative to political pressure being placed on the FDA by the White House. Will you state unequivocally that if any political pressure is applied to you and the FDA, that you will immediately report that to this committee?
I will certainly unequivocally state that if I receive political pressure, I will report to this committee. I can tell you that I have not felt political pressure, nor has the FDA, to make any decision in any specific direction.
Thank you.
Well, it's not about feelings. It's about a direct political pressure. So thank you for your response, and we'll come back.
Thank you, Ms. Heshu. Next is Mr. Lauder from Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses and all the hard work that you've been doing over the last several months for not only the United States, but for individuals from around the world. Greatly appreciate it. Dr. Fauci, if I could start my questions with you. And I know that our leader, Mr. Walden, had brought some of this up. Would you further explain how an infected individual develops antibodies and how long those antibodies remain effective in fighting off the virus? And are you seeing different levels of antibodies in people who have been infected, and what that means in terms of immunity?
Thank you very much for that question, Congressman Latta. So we need to start off by saying that we want to assume you're dealing with an antibody test that's been validated by the FDA or by the NIH. That's important because a lot of the confusion out there are tests that are not validated. But let's assume you have a good test. Whenever the body gets confronted with a virus and recovers, even when they don't recover, the body is stimulated to make antibodies. In general, for viruses that we have a lot of experience with, those antibodies serve to protect you against exposure and infection after you're exposed to the same virus. So that's what we call immunological memory, and these proteins block the virus. The one thing we do not know yet with COVID-19 is the relationship between the type of antibody, because the best antibody is called neutralizing antibody. Namely, if this were the virus, and this is where the virus binds to the cell, the neutralizing antibody blocks the virus from binding to the cell. There are antibodies against other parts of the virus that are called binding antibodies. They don't mean much. So you got to make sure you get the right antibody. The second thing is, what we still don't know is what the relationship between the titer of the antibody is, namely the level of the antibody and the degree of protection. The third thing we don't know is how long or what the duration of that antibody is going to be. We're going to find these things out as we study these individuals over months and a year or more. But remember, we're only a few months into this. So A, we know they make antibody. B, it's likely that they're protected for some period of time, but we don't know how long that's going to be. So the question I always get asked, which is a subtext, does that mean if you're exposed and you have antibody that you're protected? Likely you are, but we don't know how long you are protected.
All right, well, thank you. Dr. Redfield, excuse me, when a vaccine or treatment is developed, how will it be distributed to Americans?
Thank you for the question. It's a critical issue that is currently under discussion within the team to look at what the appropriate prioritization for distribution is. I want to just comment that it may be very dependent on what the product is. Each of these vaccine products that are currently being developed may in fact have differential utilization for different populations. So there is serious consideration to try to develop those prioritizations, and it's going to be important to develop them dependent on the product that they're going to be applied to.
Thank you. Dr. Hahn, and thanks very much for all your work, and thanks for taking my calls, especially on Friday nights and on Saturdays. I appreciate it. The FDA provided an emergency use authorization for remdesivir. Do you expect or envision the FDA to issue any more EUAs for potential treatments in the fall?
Congressman, for potential therapies, is that what you asked, sir?
Right.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So we are working very closely with sponsors regarding the development of therapeutics, including with Operation Warp Speed. 131 clinical trials ongoing right now. I anticipate that we will receive data regarding several therapies in the future, plasma being one of them, what we just discussed with Congressman Walden, potentially also with some anti-inflammatory agents, as well as for monoclonal antibodies. Those are being accelerated through the pipeline and are potential therapeutics as well as prophylaxis moving forward. Again, can't prejudge the EUA process because we have to see the data, but I do anticipate that we will be receiving data.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. DeGette from Colorado.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel and welcome all of you. Many of you have appeared in front of my subcommittee, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, a number of times. And just to let you know, the O&I subcommittee is going to be continuing its investigations, both about how we responded to this and where we go in the future. So you can expect to hear from us. I have some brief questions for each witness, and I'd like to start with you, Admiral Giroir. The chairman talked about the president's comments last weekend, saying that it's a double-edged sword testing, because when you do testing, quote, you're going to find more people. And then again this morning, the president tweeted, cases are going up in the U.S. because we are testing far more than any other country and ever expanding. With smaller testing, we would show further cases. This is what he says. And he also said this morning that he doesn't joke about these things. So I know the chairman asked Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield, have they been instructed to test less? I'm going to ask you, since you are now in charge of overseeing the tests, has the president asked you to do fewer tests?
Thank you. And again, I want to clarify that neither the
yes or no will work. Yes or no will work, Admiral. Has
no,
the president asked you
the president
to do
has
fewer tests?
Neither the president nor anyone in the administration has instructed or suggested that we should do less testing, have said that to me, and we are proceeding in just the opposite. We want to do more testing of higher quality.
I want to ask you, Admiral, do you think that it's a good or a bad idea to do less testing so it will look like we have fewer cases?
My purpose in leading is to increase the number of testing. The only way that we will be able to understand who has the disease, who is infected and can pass it, and to do appropriate contact tracing is to test appropriately, smartly, in as many people as we can.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fauci, I wanted to ask you, I've seen some data the last few days that while cases are going up in this country, deaths are going down. And I've seen some reporting in media that in part that's because younger people who tend to not to die from COVID are the ones being infected. Should we see this as a positive sign, or should we still be worried?
I think it's too early to make that kind of link, Congresswoman. Let me explain. Deaths always lag considerably behind cases. You might remember that at the time that New York was in their worst situation, where the deaths were going up, and yet the cases were starting to go down. The deaths only came down multiple weeks later. So you're seeing more cases now while the deaths are going down. The concern is if those cases then infect people who wind up getting sick and go to the hospital, it is conceivable you may see the deaths going up. So I think it's too early to say because the deaths are going down.
Thank you, Doctor. And I have another question, Dr. Fauci, for you. We've seen, and I think you and I have talked about this, most vaccines take years, if not decades, to be approved and be proved efficacious. And sometimes we don't find a vaccine at all. I have two questions for you. Number one, do you believe that we will find a vaccine for the coronavirus? And number two, do you still stand by the prediction you gave us some months ago that we could actually have a vaccine by early 2021?
I feel cautiously optimistic, Congresswoman, that we will be successful in getting a vaccine. There's never a guarantee of that, but the early data that we're seeing regarding the immunogenicity and the induction of good responses makes me cautiously optimistic, always knowing that there's never a guarantee. You remember I told your committee a few months ago that a vaccine would be available from a year to 18 months. I said that in January of 2020. A year from January is December. I still think there is a reasonably good chance that by the very beginning of 2021, that if we're going to have a vaccine, that we will have it by then.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Next, we have Mrs. Rogers from Washington State. I hope.
I'm coming. Kathy McMorris Rogers is here. Am I here?
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding this hearing and appreciate our witnesses for testifying today. COVID-19 is the challenge of the century, as others have said. It's a health and economic crisis of our lifetime. We mourn the deaths of over 100,000 Americans, and we must remember that we're not out of the woods yet. I want to especially express my heartfelt gratitude for the healthcare workers, the first responders, the emergency and essential workers who have been working around the clock to fight this virus, save lives, and keep our families safe. As our experts work tirelessly to develop a vaccine and treatment, I'm confident that there's no country in the world who's better equipped to lead for a medical breakthrough than America. We can't trust China to lead. And that's why the Trump administration has created programs like Operation Warp Speed We're bringing together the very best in the public and private sector to develop countermeasures that will fight the virus. We're leveraging the power of artificial intelligence, supercomputing, and machine learning to speed up discoveries and enhance our knowledge base of the virus. In Washington state, we have top researchers as well as biotech and pharmaceutical innovators who continue to be at the forefront of these breakthroughs. I look forward to learning more and appreciate all of you being here to understand what the administration is continuing to do to lead in the development of these tests and treatments that America needs so that we can usher in a new era of innovation and healthcare cures. To win the future, keep our families healthy and safe lives, and to ensure our economy booms again, we must get this right. Dr. Fauci, as you know, adjuvants maximize the effectiveness of vaccines. Would you just explain a little bit further what an adjuvant is? And are there any novel synthetic adjuvants in the pipeline? And if so, how will they play a role in the administration's pursuit of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. An adjuvant is a product distinct from the vaccine itself, but when given in conjunction with the vaccine, it enhances the power of the immune response. So if you have a vaccine that gives a level of response that here, when you get an adjuvant together with it, you often boost it to a much higher level. We use adjuvants in several vaccines. The NIH has a major program in the pursuit and development of novel adjuvants of all different types. And in fact, that's part of the program right now to accelerate our vaccine development capability. So it's a good question, but it's a very important part of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Hahn, as you know, FDA's decentralization of diagnostic test oversight has been very helpful in expanding the availability of diagnostic tests for COVID-19, but it's temporary. Would you just speak to how this flexibility has benefited the general public and how you think it would be helpful in the future for outbreaks or novel viruses?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Appreciate the question. As you pointed out, the flexibilities have allowed us to work with test developers. This has been throughout the COVID pandemic, with all of our medical products, a balance between the oversight so that we have tests that are valid, reproducible, accurate, but at the same time allow the developers the ability to have the freedom to develop those tests. And we've developed this partnership that I think has been very fruitful moving forward. I particularly like it with respect to the flexibility given the states, your state in particular, which has an excellent public health laboratories, as well as University of Washington, and New York State's another example of this. Those are the sort of things that we're looking at now as we talk about how we want to move forward, that we could potentially put in place on a permanent basis to facilitate test development. Hopefully we'll never be in a position again where we have to develop tests over such a short period of time like we've remarkably done during this time. But we really do need to talk about how these flexibilities could stimulate innovation and development of tests.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for your leadership, your commitment during this time, the long hours, and I especially appreciate the way that we're looking forward to make sure that we are prepared in the future of whatever we may face. Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Now we go to Mr. Doyle, coming to us from Pittsburgh. Mr. Doyle? Is Mr. Doyle?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I forgot to unmute.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and the ranking member also, and to our witnesses for your service on behalf of the American people. This committee has continued to conduct oversight of the Trump administration's shortcomings related to procuring and distributing personal protective equipment, or PPE. When states and hospitals were faced with critical shortages of PPE, such as masks and gowns, President Trump passed the buck and said the federal government was, quote, not a shipping clerk. We saw the result of a failure of leadership. Without a national strategy, states have had to fend for themselves and even compete against each other for critical supplies. It's become so desperate out there that one former U.S. disaster official referred to this scramble as, quote, Lord of the Flies PPE edition. At a recent hearing before the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer testified, quote, the lack of centralized coordination at the federal level created a counterproductive competition between the states and federal government to secure limited supplies, driving up prices and exacerbating existing shortages. Admiral Greer, let me ask you, do we have enough PPE for every frontline worker who needs it, whether they be healthcare workers, first responders, or thousands of others whose job puts them at risk, or people still having to reuse N95 masks, for example? And if we don't have enough, why hasn't the administration invoked DPA to greatly expand the manufacturing of these supplies?
Well, thank you for the question. And I will do my best to answer that. Admiral Polubchek is certainly running the supply chain with also Dr. Kadlec from ASPR. But being a member of the Unified Coordination Group at FEMA for the past 3 months, I'm pretty familiar with this. I think as Admiral Polubchek testified before, and I think we all know, is that there was an absolute shortage of everything when this started. Everyone in the world was looking for the same supplies, and we tried to manage that both from increasing the supplies and using the DPA multiple times. For example, there were 3 investments, DPA Title I, for N95s, 3M, Honeywell, and Owens & Minor, to improve production. We estimate that the country in the fall, if there were a COVID outbreak to this degree, would need about 140 million N95s per month. We should have 180 million per month being produced domestically by that time. This was not available when we started in March. The industry was not here. This was all offshored. And I'll just say cumulatively between March 1st and June 19th, the government distributed or enabled the commercial distribution through the air bridge of 160 million N95 masks, 638 million surgical and procedural masks, 281 million gowns, and over 16 billion pairs of gloves. So this was really an enormous effort. We need to be better prepared. This all needs to be onshore. We're working with SNS 2.0 to have a 60 to 90-day supply. We talk to governors in every state. Many of the states are also doing their own supplies for 60 to 90 days, so I'm confident moving from here on as we ramp domestic manufacturing that we're going to be in a much better position than we were 3 months ago.
Thank you, Admiral. Dr. Hahn, let me ask you, since demand for PPE increased this spring, we've seen many actors with little previous experience in the supply field enter the market. Reports have indicated that some are selling counterfeit or low-quality products that don't meet safety requirements or unable to fulfill agreements. What steps is the FDA taking to ensure that companies are not circumventing federal oversight and injecting potentially substandard PPE into the United States market?
Thank you, Congressman. This is a really important issue. During the height of this epidemic and the increased demand, we provided regulatory flexibility for companies, but insisted that they provide certification, often foreign FDAs, if you will, certification that the PPE met the requirements that we have in place and that the foreign governments had in place. But we did something else with respect to that, and that is we also partnered with CDC and NIOSH, for example, with N95s, to test, to verify that, in fact, that self-certification over the validity of the efficacy of the PPE was in place. And you've correctly identified that for a variety of reasons, subsequent product that was shipped into the country did not meet those specifications. We immediately took action to make sure that those were off of the market and continue to do that and monitor it very closely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Next, we have Mr. Guthrie coming to us from Kentucky. Are you muted? Do you want to unmute?
I thought I did that. I apologize. Hi, Brett Guthrie. I apologize. Hi, Dr. Hahn. Dr. Hahn, I'm interested in the COVID-19 counterfeit testing, and I have a bill that would bring. It's called the Safeguarding Therapeutics Act that would ensure FDA has the authority to destroy the counterfeit tests and devices. And I'll follow up with a question with this. What I'm interested in, what the people that I talk to every day are interested in is what's going on in the future. How are we going to protect ourselves moving forward? We need to lessons learned from the past. We need to look forward. And Dr. Hahn kind of answered on, Admiral Gerard answered on the PPE kind of moving forward. But if I could just go with Dr. Redenfield, Dr. Fauci, and then Dr. Hahn, if you'll talk about pool testing and how that might be effective. Well, the people that I talk to want to know what's it going to look like in March? What's it going to look like in August? Are kids going to be getting back in school? Are nursing homes going to be safe? That's what people are looking for. So Dr. Redenfield, I know we're going to have flu, we're going to have COVID. What's the testing going to be like? Dr. Fauci, what do we need to be looking for in Dr. Hahn pool testing? And I'll just open it up for you three to talk about what's it going to look like in August, and are kids going to be able to go back to school? And I'll start with Dr. Redenfield.
Thank you, Congressman. I think first and foremost, it's really important that we continue to take this time to continue to accelerate our capacity to diagnose obviously readily available timely test results, build that capacity for isolation and contact tracing, and self-quarantine. That's fundamental. We're working hard to do that. As I mentioned, in January, we had about 6,000 contact tracers in this country. At the beginning of June, it was up to around 28,000. It needs to continue to increase, in my view, towards 100,000. And we get that operationally functional. That's going to be critical for what we're doing. Secondly, we do have to reinforce in the American public the importance of the social distancing interventions that we've discussed, particularly face covering, 6 feet distancing, and hand washing. I anticipate that the states will begin to open up higher education and K through 12. It's going to be on a jurisdiction-to-jurisdiction decision. CDC will be issuing additional guidance on this topic in the days ahead as we continue to try to work and give guidance how to open up these, particularly the school systems, how to open them up safely. I will end with nursing homes. I think we've made an enormous progress in the long-term care facilities, enhancing infection control. Admiral Gerard may want to comment about the commitment that FEMA made to provide all nursing homes protective equipment for a period of time. And we're continuing, I think, to have aggressive surveillance in the nursing homes across this country, where we've recommended that all residents get tested so that we can start with a clean baseline of understanding where the epidemic is. I will just end with the fact that although they only make up 0.6% of our population, nursing home residents have made up more than 35% of our mortality.
Let me very briefly.
Thank you, Dr. Redenfield.
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, let me briefly address the question you asked about schools, because we get asked that all the time. I think the important thing to point out is that, as you well know, we live in a very big country that is certainly not a unidimensional country. It's very, very different, whether you're in a New York metropolitan area or Casper, Wyoming. So when you're asking about schools, you have to say, where are you talking about? Because we have different regions, different states, different cities, towns, and counties. So some counties may have such a low level of infection that schools can open in a way that's exactly like normal. Others may be in a situation where it isn't really bad where you want to close the school, but you might want to make some modifications, alterations of scheduling, things like morning, afternoon, one day or another day. So it's up to the local officials to evaluate where you are in the particular about the guidance of opening schools. So you don't want to make one size fits all for the United States. You want to tailor it to the degree of viral dynamics in the particular location that you're talking about.
So looking forward, we're really only going to know when we get closer to that point, so we can make those decisions. That's unfortunate, but obviously the reality. I'm about out of time, Dr. Hahn. I'll submit a question for the record for pool sampling. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie. It sounded like there was a monster that was going to envelop you at some point there. Next, we have Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses. I have to disagree with you, Dr. Redfield. I think nowhere has the Trump administration's lack of leadership been more apparent than in our nation's nursing homes and long-term care facilities, where we've lost 50,000 residents and workers to COVID-19. So let's review some of the deadly failures. You delayed data collection on cases and deaths in nursing homes. You have not required states to conduct testing. You are not giving workers adequate PPE, and I agree with Congressman Doyle on that, to protect themselves. You are allowing facilities to literally kick residents out onto the street if there's a more profitable COVID patient to take their place. And since CMS Administrator Verma, who is responsible for the safety of our nursing home residents, has declined Chairman Pallone's invitation to speak, let me refer then to Dr. Redfield. The CDC website explains that your mission is to save lives by providing health information that protects our nation. So why didn't you require nursing homes to report any data on COVID-19 cases and deaths until May, 4 months after, you may remember, you told me about the first case in Illinois, January 30th, and to report the case of human-to-human transfer. On June 4th, you testified before the House Appropriations Committee and apologized for CDC's inadequate, I quote, response to COVID-19 race and ethnicity data. Yet, the same day, CMS and CDC finally published COVID-19 data from nursing homes and failed to include race and ethnicity information. So when my office asked CMS about the exclusion, we were told to ask the CDC. So will you promise to include race and ethnicity information moving forward so that we can identify and address the racial disparities in nursing home COVID-19 cases?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. First, I want to stress that since the early beginning of the pandemic, we've initially encouraged all nursing homes to report the cases through their health departments and through our National Healthcare Safety Network as of May 8th.
If I could just briefly interrupt on the word encourage. That, I think, is a problem, that there's been guidance, there's been encouragement, but what about mandating?